Children No More. Part 4 of the Razee Saga. The Alliance chamber gleamed with new banners that had never flown together before. Earth's deep blue and silver crest hung beside the red sunburst of Cryon, the molten iron sigil of Savran, and the braided golden crimson standard of the Tartans. Their colors draped across curved walls of alloy and crystal, an architectural union of every world now sworn to the promise. The chamber itself had been carved into the heart of the Iron Bastion, the station that loomed like a shield over Savran III, and its halls carried the low murmur of voices that had not spoken in one accord since the Federation first claimed dominion over the stars. Admiral Buck Rivers sat at the head of the circular table, his uniform crisp, his eyes carved with lines of fatigue and defiance. Around him stood the weight of the galaxy's last hope. Cryon's delegates wore their battle plate in solemn silence, silver armor etched with symbols of their star-forged clans. Savran's counselors draped themselves in obsidian cloaks that shimmered faintly with ziridium dust, a reminder of the lifeblood they brought to the Alliance's ships. The Tartans arrived like thunder-given form, their representatives towering in scarlet armor, braids of silver hair falling across shoulders thick as fortress gates. The chamber settled as the council began. The air was heavy not merely with ceremony, but with the clash of histories colliding. Cryon eyes narrowed at Savran robes, memories of border skirmishes and centuries of suspicion simmering beneath the polished words of unity. Savran's measured voices spoke of cooperation, yet their glances betrayed caution, distrust balanced only by the promise of shared survival. They would stand together now, but the weight of their past wars lingered like smoke no council fire could banish in a single day. Still, there was recognition, even respect. Cryon captains who had once sworn to never fight beside Savran now nodded grimly across the table, conceding that Earth's Marines had forged something new between them. The battles at Cryon 5 and the fields of Savran 3 had proven that difference did not mean weakness. The Alliance was not perfect, but it was real, and that reality was more powerful than Federation whispers of conquest. It was the Tartans who broke the silence, their envoy standing with a voice like gravel rolling through stone halls. They spoke of Earth's youth, of their audacity, of how the galaxy had always dismissed sapiens as children reaching for weapons they did not understand. Their eyes burned across the table, challenging Buck Rivers and every human present. Could Earth lead warriors whose ancestors had fought for millennia, when Earth itself had only just raised its first fleets to the stars? The question cut deep, but the answer lay not in words. The banners above spoke for themselves. The Iron Bastion's walls thrummed with the heartbeat of a fortress no other world had dared to build outside Federation command. Cryon had pledged their cruisers, Savran their ziridium, Tartans their dreadnoughts, and Earth had pledged everything. Buck Rivers rose not as a conqueror, but as a man bearing the weight of shared destiny. His hand swept across the chamber not to claim but to offer. Earth did not seek dominion. Earth sought survival, and survival demanded more than one world's pride. The Council was not Earth's throne. It was a circle forged so no single banner would stand above the others. Leadership here meant leading together, each world standing as a pillar of something greater than the Federation had ever allowed to exist. The Tartans grumbled, but even they could not deny what their eyes saw. Earth's fleets had grown where none thought possible. Earth's Marines had trained Cryon and Savran soldiers into warriors who fought with unity no ancient empire had ever wrought. Every battle Earth fought was not for conquest, but for the right of all free peoples to decide their own fate. That truth silenced even the proudest voices. The chamber darkened as the holomap bloomed into the air. Star systems spread like constellations across the void, but too many burned with crimson light. Federation fleets had gathered along the trade lanes, choking the lifeblood of neutral worlds, enforcing blockades that starved planets into compliance. Their capital ships clustered at the edges of Alliance space, waiting for the order to strike. The murmurs returned, sharper now, filled with unease. Some spoke of retreat, others of delay, but the map made liars of them all. The Federation was not waiting for parley. It was waiting for the moment to crush them before they could stand. Buck's voice rang like steel on stone. This was not the time for hesitation. Not the time for whispers of distrust or echoes of the past. This was the moment the Alliance must rise, not as subjects, not as children, but as a chorus of worlds that would not bend. Cryon's generals nodded first, their armored fists clashing against their chests in solemn pledge. Savrin's counselors lowered their obsidian hoods, voices steady with resolve. The Tartans, after a long silence, gave their assent with a single word that shook the chamber like a battle drum. The Alliance had spoken. Their first act would not be to cower behind bastions or wait for the hammer to fall. They would strike. They would break the blockade, shatter the chains cast across the lanes of trade, and announce to the galaxy that the age of Earth's children had ended. In the shadows beyond the Council's reach, ancient powers stirred. Watching, waiting, measuring whether this fragile alliance of banners was a fleeting flame, or the fire that would burn the Federation's rule to ash. The promise had been made. The sword had been drawn. The bastion had been built. Now the children were no more. They gathered at the rim of the bastion's shadow as if the fortress itself had exhaled a constellation. Tug lines hissed away, beacon lights winked off one by one, and the black between the banners swallowed the glare until only hull silhouettes and running marks remained. Before departure orders could ripple through the spine of the fleet, a new shadow slid into the pattern and bent starlight around itself like a hand closing over a flame. Isabella II arrived without ceremony and needed none. Larger than her namesake and built on a lengthened stealth hull, she drifted in on minimal burns, her surfaces eating what little light touched them. Even powered, she wore the quiet of a knife sheathed beneath a cloak. Cloaking lattices bled a heat haze that wasn't heat at all, a ripple of misdirection that folded sensors into their own expectations and returned nothing certain. From her spine, the newest gift glittered and vanished, warp veins that did not spool in long-song harmonics but in a staccato pulse, calibrated to tear a hole in space small enough to step through and close again before an enemy could even say that it had been there. She could vanish and reappear on a different vector in the time it took a gun crew to inhale. She came with Earth's Second Fleet angling behind her, destroyers and frigates sliding into a defensive wheel that wrapped itself instinctively around Cryon's approaches. They were not raw. Their hulls wore the fresh paint of refit and the old scratches of service, and their engines took their places with the discipline of ships that had drilled until formation was reflex. Isabella II broke from their vanguard and drifted toward the Razee II like a daughter ship stepping beside a patriarch. She was not junior, not merely newer. She was that rare evolution that made even old captains go quiet for a heartbeat as they measured the scale of what they were now asked to wield. Elsewhere in the pattern, the elder shadow gave a final salute in the language of beacons and hull tilt. Isabella, the namesake, slipped through the screen of escorts, her camouflage nets dissolving, her prow angled toward the lane back to the bastion. She would fight one more time at Halros 9, then return to dock to yield her ghost's mantle to the successor now sliding Starwood. The old systems had served beyond their design and would be honored with a refit worthy of what she had survived. The Razee, no longer the flagship yet newly reborn, loomed like a memory rebuilt in steel. Where her decks had once held 800 fighters, the hangars now stacked 200 more in nested bays and vertical cradles that kissed launch rails with magnetic teeth. Shield bulwarks glittered with ziridium-primed inclusions in a lattice that promised to flex like muscle and spring back like tempered glass. The weapon spines that ridged her dorsal line hummed with a deeper, meaner tone. Engines that had once sung a smooth carrier's chorus now carried a throaty war note. She took station not as a spear point but as a sentinel, a veteran turned guardian, her squadrons already fanning out to practice intercept arcs over Cryon. And then came the ship that drew every eye because she refused to be grand about it. The Shepherd emerged from a ripple of altered starlight and shed her camouflage as if shrugging out of fog. Warhammer class by designation, but there the lineage ended. This hull was a thesis written in angles, a geometry of intent. Cloaking swaddled her in the same deep mesh field the Razee II wore, a veil that flexed rather than tore under scrutiny. Shields layered in petals, overlapping without harmonic interference, the signatures stacked like scales on some abyssal thing that did not care what struck it. Along her teal ran guns that did not belong to any catalog Buck Rivers had seen, not rail nor beam nor the old plasma roar, but a new Earth invention that bent energy into a focused, staggered cascade, packets of force coupled and delayed through a lattice so that impacts arrived like a drummer's roll, each strike hammering the last deeper. Test footage had showed armor peeling in petals, not from a single blow but from the insistence of resonance refusing to let structure forget what had just happened to it. Shepherds slid to the Razee's side and their silhouettes became the language of home front and bulwark. Around them, the remainder of Second Fleet sealed the ring. Cruisers set their noses toward Cryon's pale silver star. Pickets took their lanes along the high gravitational contours, and corvettes loped wide to harry anything that tried to slip through the nets. The new fleet would defend Cryon while the main body rode for Halros 9 and the breaking of a chokehold. Admiral Buck Rivers watched the pattern resolve from the Razee 2 Swar Dome, where Hololite and Viewport met and one never quite knew which had the truth. He measured not just hull counts but the feel of a formation when it settled into readiness. The great ship around him had been born a terror and grown into a promise. Now it readied itself to become a verdict. Power crept through conduits and pulses that matched his heartbeat. The carrier's ribbed spine carried a throb of launch cadence as ordnance crews locked munitions and armsmen ran checks with the practiced fury of people who knew how to be fast without becoming sloppy. Below, General Thomas Tudor walked the flight lines and boarding tunnels with his helmet under his arm, face lit by the low work lights of an army at idle that would not be idle much longer. Marines from Earth tightened harnesses and shared the last quiet gestures before chaos. Cryon troopers stood beside them with their solemnity worn into the creases of their gauntlets, learning the new cadence of Sapiens' hand sign and the economy of movement that made a squad more dangerous than its count. Saverin exocets clicked as seals bit down, Maker's sigils glinting in the dim as if each suit remembered the ore veins it had come from. Even Tartans stalked through bays that were not theirs, heads bent over schematics to learn the layout of another species' corridors so that, in a boarding run, they would never pause to wonder which intersection led to a generator and which to a dead end. The War Council's last decisions moved into muscle memory. Isabella II took the point she had built herself to hold, forward and slightly off-axis, where her blink drive could slit space and place her eyes in the path of an ambush before the ambush realized it had an audience. The Tartan's dreadnoughts fell in behind the Razee 2, not fawning, not subordinate, but aligned at last with a purpose larger than their pride. Cryon battlecruisers took the long arcs to port, Saverin cruisers to starboard, each formation bent to wrap and squeeze rather than dash and shatter. The plan had not changed. A single fist of 4 worlds landing in unity where the Federation assumed only fingers loosely curled. Transit windows opened like irises. The starfield stretched, not purely in sight but in the mind's interpretation of how things should look when laws were asked politely to make room. The Razee 2's main drives spooled to the pitch that made bones want to hum. The shepherds of navigation marked a path wrapped in the blind spots of patrol routes and the silence between listening posts. One by one, ships stepped into the long dark. The fleet slid into the tunnel between what was and where it needed to be. Time thinned, color bruised. Distance became a hotel corridor with too many identical doors. In that stretched interval, the Alliance breathed with one set of lungs. Status chants rose and fell. Life support green, reactor balanced, shield pedals cycling, ordnance sealed, and then subsided to the hush that always followed when 1,000 checks came back true. Pilots stared past themselves into the fight they could feel approaching, letting their thoughts trace the first seconds of launch. Boost, roll, vector, tally, brake. Boarders let their hands walk corridors they had not yet set foot in, remembering the feel of bulkhead ridges beneath gloves and the weight shift of a hard turn. On the shield decks, Saverin engineers tended Zeridium cores with the reverence of medics tending hearts. In gunnery vaults, human crews laid hands on new emitters and let the Shepherds' test footage play once more, not because they needed to see metal fail again but because they needed to feel the refusal in their own bodies. Refusal to vanish, to be contained, to be quieted. Cryon officers in the port formation spoke softly to their hulls the way people speak to animals they respect, acknowledging the old scars and promising new ones would be earned with purpose. Tartans sharpened blades they did not need and sealed armor they had never shed in battle. Ritual more than necessity, a beat-to-beat reminder that ceremony becomes steel when the moment calls for it. In the Razee 2's dome, Buck let his gaze rest for a long breath on the place where Isabella had hovered moments before. The old hunter would make one last run then go home. Legacy was not a monument. It was a relay, baton passed in motion because stopping meant dying. He shifted his view to Isabella 2's ghost mark on the tactical plot flickering just ahead of the fleet's nose. She winked out, reappeared 12,000 kilometers to starboard, then again forward, prowling ahead of what most would have called the front but what she treated as a shifting idea. Her wake was a rumor, her signature a suggestion. She hunted for the shape of a trap not yet sprung. The Shepherd eased her power another fraction higher and her new guns purred, not eager, simply present. Beyond Cryon, the defensive ring tightened as Second Fleet completed its weave, the Razee old and indomitable holding the center like a veteran who had traded sprinting for planting his feet and being the place that did not move. Cryon's orbital stations brightened their halos, and civilian traffic bent its routes through safe corridors etched in the air like chalk lines on a dark floor. Between stars, the fleet's speed became patience. They felt the first ripples of the Halros 9 gravity well before the hazard markers confirmed range. Distortions chased over sensor glass like the shadow of wings. Communications compressed to the essentials. Coil tension took the place of speech. In a forward compartment, a Marine closed his eyes and pictured the first hatch giving way. In a Cryon bridge, a captain counted backward along a timeline that ended in the flare of main batteries. In a Tartan ready room, a war leader settled into the knowledge that for once his dreadnought would not be asked to be the only wall that held. Isabella II blinked again and found the edge of a net. Buoys burrowed into the dark, passives with teeth, linked on a lattice of whisper beams that could call a hunter pack before a ship fully crossed their line. She vanished and reappeared inside the ring, tasted the tone of their handshake, learned the false quiet they wore when pretending to be debris. The information flowed aft like water under ice. The Razee 2's lights dimmed to battle quiet. The Alliance's fist eased back, drew breath, and began to close. The Blockade waited on the other side of the curtain. Somewhere far behind, in the hush around Cryon's star, the new fleet settled into the long stillness of guardianship. Banners hung in bays where families watched the news reports spaceward, and the Razee's old hull kept its station in the invisible weather of gravity and rumor, casting a shadow that had nothing to do with light, an assurance that when the main fleet rode into the fire, home would not be empty. Ahead, Halros 9's lanes braided themselves into a noose. The Federation's marks whispered over scopes like a taunt. The Alliance's pulse climbed, then steadied. Space narrowed to a corridor cut with intent. They came out of the dark as one, and the system of Halros 9 stretched before them like a wound bound in iron. Where once a constellation of trade rings glittered with the life of hundreds of worlds, now the stations bled dim light, their beacons low, their comm lines strangled into silence by the weight of Federation guns. Blockade fleets hung across the lanes like chains, titans in cold formation, their hulls painted in the black and silver of Imperial dominion. Civilian ships cowered near the skeletal frames of orbital platforms, engines cold, life support bleeding into ration cycles sold back to them by their jailers. The Alliance fleet dropped into that silence, and the silence cracked. Sensors screamed warnings as gravity nets lit up across the system, interdictors pulsing their fields in waves meant to pin the new arrivals where they emerged, crushing maneuver before it could begin. The Federation had been waiting. They had woven this trap with patience, ready to strangle the Alliance in the cradle. Isabella II slipped her leash first. Cloaks bent, veins flickered, and in the time it took the enemy to paint her signature, she was gone. She reappeared like a phantom blade against the nearest interdictor, her guns carving through the relay tower before the crew aboard could cry alarm. The gravity nets staggered, sputtering, and the Alliance surged forward before the cage could close again. Buck River's orders rippled down the line. Tartans roared into the heart of the Blockade with their dreadnoughts, war drums given form, each broadside a storm that shook the Blockade wall. The Razee 2 anchored behind them, her fighter bays vomiting squadrons in disciplined waves, hundreds of craft sweeping through the openings like claws into flesh. Cryon cruisers rolled to port, their angular hulls cutting fire arcs across the Federation line. Sovereign warships swung wide starboard, shields shimmering with ziridium veins as they absorbed the first hammering salvos. And then the Shepherd spoke. Her prow lit with an earthborn fury no one had seen before, a resonance cascade that leapt across the void in staggered beats. The first Federation capital ship to taste it shuddered, its armor plates rippling like water struck by stones. Then the plates peeled, blooming outward in a cascade of failure, each hammer beat driving the cracks deeper until the ship tore open and vented flame and bodies into the void. Even the Tartans paused, eyes wide at a weapon that unmade ships not with one blow but with the merciless insistence of rhythm. The Blockade line reeled. Federation cruisers shifted to plug the breach, but Isabella II blinked again, ahead and behind, carving gaps with sudden strikes that left escorts blind and confused. Into those gaps poured Earth's fighters, Cryon interceptors, Savran bombers. The void filled with fire trails and shattered hulls, the dance of small craft spilling blood in arcs too fast for the eye to follow. General Thomas Tudor moved then. Dropships launched from the Razee II and the Shepherd, streaking toward the Federation's interdictors that still spat their gravshear across the field. Tudor rode in the first wave, his armor sealed, his blade magnetized to his gauntlet, his voice calm as he carried Earth's Marines and their allies into the fire. They struck like meteors against the hull, cutting through airlocks and bulkheads, corridors echoing with the thunder of rifles and the clash of steel. Cryon troopers flanked them, disciplined lines broken now into fluid fire teams, their precision sharpened by Earth's doctrine. Savran warriors, once hesitant, now surged with confidence, their exocets glowing as they drove Federation defenders back step by step. Tudor himself led the assault on the largest interdictor, a ship as long as a city, its gravity wells threatening to crush the battle no matter how many relays Isabella II severed. They fought through fire and smoke, clearing deck by deck, until the command spire fell into their hands. With a single coded order, the gravshear died and the Alliance fleet breathed free again. But freedom lasted only heartbeats. New signatures tore space open on the far edge of the system. A second Federation wave arrived, battleships emerging in disciplined blocks, heavier than the first, their guns already aligned. The blockade was not to be held, it was to be crushed, and this was the hammer's fall. Yet the Alliance was ready. Isabella II blinked across their formation, her sudden presence inside their lines scattering targeting locks. Tartans shifted as one, dreadnoughts wheeling to smash into the flank of the reinforcements with fire that burned brighter than stars. Cryon cruisers and Savran bombers struck from either side, collapsing the enemy's cohesion before it could harden. The Shepherd unleashed her resonance cannons again, and another Federation giant cracked and folded. The battle roared, fire painting the darkness, wreckage tumbling through orbit like burning rain. The blockade broke. Merchant lanes opened in ragged gaps and desperate relief ships surged forward, daring the firestorm with holds full of food and medicine. Across half the galaxy, systems watched the live feeds pour from Halros 9, eyes wide as the impossible unfolded before them. The Federation could be beaten. The children had bloodied their parents' hand. The guns quieted hours later, the silence now filled with wreckage and smoke. Alliance ships drifted with scars carved deep into their hulls, victory written in fire and sacrifice. The stations of Halros 9 lit their beacons again, weak but free, signals reaching out in gratitude to the fleet that had come for them. On the bridge of the Razee II, Buck Rivers stood in the dim light, eyes on the shattered blockade. Relief was brief, for even as the wreckage cooled, a message cut across the silence, carried on a secure Federation band. The children raised their hands against their parents. For this they will be disciplined. The words echoed across the chamber, heavy as a sentence already passed. Buck's jaw tightened as he looked at the map, knowing the next clash would not be blockade lines and starving stations. The Federation would come with fleets larger than the galaxy had seen in centuries, and they would come soon. The Alliance had won Halros 9. But the war was only beginning. The banners rose again in the council chamber of the Bastion, colors brighter now with the fire of victory. Halros 9 was free. The blockade lay in ruins. For the first time, the Alliance sat not as dreamers or as survivors, but as victors. The chamber carried that weight, every voice quieter, every gesture more deliberate, as though none wished to break the fragile reality of what they had achieved. Admiral Buck Rivers stood in the circle and let the silence linger. When he spoke, it was not to boast, but to plant the next stone in a path they could not yet see the end of. The blockade had been broken, yes, but it would come again. The Federation would never let trade lanes flow freely where Earth's promise held sway, unless the Alliance made them permanent. He turned the holomap to Halros 9 and its wounded stations, still reeling from months of starvation. He proposed what none had dared before. A permanent bastion there, a stronghold to anchor the arteries of commerce. Guns, shields, repair yards and barracks. A station not merely rebuilt but reborn as a fortress of trade. A declaration that the lanes would never again be strangled without a fight. For a moment, distrust whispered in the chamber. Cryon's eyes flickered toward Savran, Savran's toward Tartan's. But one by one, the memories of Halros overrode suspicion. They had bled together, lost together, and risen together. The banners above were no longer decoration, they were proof. The proposal passed. Every world pledged ships, alloys, Zeridium manpower. Together they would forge Halros into a citadel no blockade could choke again. The moment of unity was broken by a cry for help. The Tartan's envoys stiffened as their comms pulsed with encrypted distress, relays from the far reaches of Tartan space. Pirates, bandit clans that had long festered in the shadows, preying on the Tartan's forgotten status, had struck at outlying stations. Even warriors of such legend could not be everywhere at once. Their home was strong, but their borders were fraying. The chamber shifted from triumph to urgency. Without hesitation, Buck Rivers rose again. The Razee II, Isabella II, and the Shepherd would answer, joined by 3 Cryon battlecruisers and 6 Sovereign escorts. They would fly not merely as aid but as the promise made flesh, that no banner in this council would ever stand alone again. Hours later, the Alliance fleet translated into Tartan space. What they found was not an Empire's warfleet but scavenger packs, pirate warbands fattened on neglect. They had raided unarmed convoys, shattered mining outposts, and harried the edges of Tartan patrols, never expecting the weight of 4 worlds to descend upon them at once. The Razee II's fighter wings scythed through their swarms. Isabella II blinked into their rear guard, her guns tearing command ships apart before they even realized she was among them. The Shepherd's resonance cannons reduced their heaviest hulls to molten slag. Cryon formations boxed them in, Sovereign bombers rained fire into their holds, and the Tartans themselves led the final charge, boarding the last pirate fortress ship with blade and rifle until silence fell. The battle was short. The lesson was long. Within hours, Alliance supply ships followed through the breach. They came laden with more than aid. They carried the skeletons of defensive platforms, prefabricated and waiting. Buck Rivers had anticipated the need. The stations unfolded in orbit, ringed with guns, shield arrays, and docking arms. What had been raided space became a fortified corridor. The Tartans had asked for help against bandits and received the foundations of a citadel. In the aftermath, the Tartan leaders stood in the council chamber aboard their flagship, watching Earth supply ships weld armor into the void, Cryon engineers wiring power conduits, Sovereign technicians spooling Zeridium cores into shield mounts. They spoke little, but their eyes carried the truth. They had thought Earth bold, perhaps reckless, perhaps too new to lead. Now they saw foresight, strategy, and a promise that did not waver. The Alliance had bled together at Halros 9. At Tartus they had proven something greater: trust. And as the banners rose again, the galaxy shifted one step further away from Federation dominion. The galaxy did not wait long to answer Halros 9. In the days that followed, news spread across neutral worlds like wildfire. Stations that had once whispered of Earth as children now spoke of them with hushed awe, and sometimes with fear. Merchants dared the reopened lanes, bringing food, medicine, and raw materials into systems that had nearly starved. For the first time in generations, a blockade had been broken, not by the Federation but against it. The Federation could not allow the wound to fester. The storm came without preamble. At first it was rumors, patrols lost at the edges of Sovereign space, scouts that never returned from Cryon's frontier. Then the shadows thickened. Probes fell silent. Relay stations failed. And then the Bastion's holomap lit with signatures that blotted out stars. The Federation was coming not with raiding fleets or blockades, but with a war front. The council chamber shook with the weight of what the map revealed. Hundreds of ships in tight formation, their cores burning like a chain of suns, carriers, battleships, dreadnoughts older than Cryon's written history, all bearing down on Alliance space. This was no feint, no warning. It was the full hand unveiled, a blow meant to break not only the Alliance's fleets, but the idea of the Alliance itself. Buck Rivers studied the map in silence while the council argued. Cryon urged to fall back to fortified systems, to bleed the enemy across a dozen skirmishes. Sovereign argued for dispersal, to hide their strength and strike from shadows. The Tartans, proud and fierce, called to meet the storm head-on. The voices rose until the chamber itself seemed to pulse with division. Buck let them speak, then raised his hand and the banners fell silent. The Federation wanted fear, wanted hesitation, wanted the Alliance to scatter like children before the rod. The only answer was unity here and now before the first shot. He spoke not as a conqueror but as a commander who had seen the price of retreat, and who knew that if they gave the Federation even one step of ground, the galaxy would see it as proof that nothing had changed. The Razee II, Isabella II, and the Shepherd would form the Alliance's core, with Tartans anchoring their dreadnoughts alongside. Cryon and Savran would wheel the flanks, forming a spear point as they had at Halros 9. But this time there would be no surprise, no cloak of audacity. This time the enemy came prepared and the Alliance would stand exposed. The fleets mustered with grim efficiency. The Razee II's hangars brimmed with fighters, every cradle filled, reserve craft armed and sealed. Isabella II prowled the edges of formation, testing her blink drives against the heavy gravity of the gathering storm. The Shepherd thrummed with power, her resonance cannons spitting test pulses into the void, each one shaking space with promises of destruction. Tartan dreadnoughts aligned, their hulls scarred but steady, their crews already chanting the old war songs of their people. Cryon cruisers linked in unison, their captains bowing to Earth's coordination. Savran fleets shimmered with ziridium light, their shields blazing like the veins of a living titan. And then the Federation arrived. They filled the dark with numbers too great to count at a glance. Carriers vomited fighters in clouds, swarming so thick that the stars vanished behind them. Battleships lined their hulls in overlapping formations, their weapons cycling with clockwork precision. And at their heart, 3 colossal dreadnoughts, ships so vast they seemed to bend space itself, their names whispered only in Federation records. Titans never unleashed against a frontier foe, now pointed like knives at the Alliance. The first salvos struck with the fury of gods. The Razee II rocked as shields flared, ziridium layers bending and holding but dimming under the barrage. Cryon's cruisers fired back, beams lancing into the dark, while Savran's bombers dove into the swarm with the desperation of hunters outnumbered 100 to 1. Tartans charged headlong, their dreadnoughts slamming into the Federation line, each broadside tearing enemy ships apart even as their own armor screamed. Isabella II blinked through the chaos, reappearing inside the Federation's swarm to rip apart carrier cores, vanishing again before the retaliatory storm could lock her. The Shepherd's cannons roared, their resonance peeling another battleship open like fruit, the shockwave throwing escorts into disarray. But for every Federation ship destroyed, 2 more pressed in. The void filled with wreckage and fire, fighter against fighter, blade against blade in boarding corridors lit only by muzzle flashes. Tudor led Marines into the belly of a Federation carrier, carving through steel and bodies until they detonated its hangars from within. Cryon warriors stood shoulder to shoulder with Savran exocets, their old distrust washed away in the tide of blood. Still the Federation pressed. Still the Titans loomed. From the bridge of the Razee II, Buck Rivers saw the line bend but not break. The Bastion's council had given their word, and now the banners above his head reminded him why. They were no longer children. The Federation's blow was heavy, but the Alliance had one answer left: to endure long enough that the galaxy itself would see the storm and know it could not unmake them. The counterstrike had begun, and it would not end in silence. The storm thickened until it seemed no Alliance hull could survive it. The Federation Titans bore down, their guns vomiting light across the void, their fighters blotting the stars. Every sensor burned with overload. Every hull screamed under pressure. And still the Alliance fought. From the Bastion-built stronghold at Halros 9, the new station defenses awoke in full fury. What had once been a trade ring became a fortress. Batteries mounted along its spines unleashed torrents of plasma, slicing into Federation cruisers that strayed too close. Shield arrays, fed by ziridium cores and overcharged by Savran engineers, absorbed punishment that would have annihilated any civilian outpost. And in its heart, Earth's new weapons, rail accelerators that fired guided projectiles at a fraction of light, punched through battleships with the precision of a surgeon's hand. The trading station, once prey, had become a predator. But the battle hinged not on platforms or fleets, but on a single ship. At the heart of the Federation formation loomed their flagship, an immense dreadnought older than Cryon's dynasties, armored in layers thicker than cities, its hull bristling with weapons that made even the Razee II might seem small. It directed the storm. It held the Federation's will. And as long as it stood, the Alliance would bleed to death around it. General Thomas Tudor knew this truth and he did not hesitate. 5,000 Marines launched in wave after wave, boarding pods streaking through fire, exocets sealed, rifles primed. Cryon warriors followed in their transports. Savarn exocets leapt from carrier bays. Tartan slammed through the void in boarding rams that cracked steel. They struck the flagship with everything they had. The battle aboard was a nightmare of steel corridors and burning decks. Marines surged through hulls that groaned under bombardment, cutting through defenders who fought with the desperation of those who knew their ship was the center of the war. Cryon blades clashed with Federation pikes. Savarn exocets drove through choke points. Tartans split bulkheads with brute force. Tudor led from the front, his sword flashing, his rifle never still, carving a path toward the command spire. The flagship shuddered under the assault. Systems failed one by one. Hangars detonated as Alliance troops set charges. Fire blossomed in compartments meant never to see flame. The Federation commander fought to rally, but the tide was unstoppable. Tudor himself led the charge into the bridge, his armor scorched, his blade dripping fire, until the defenders lay broken and the heart of the flagship fell into Alliance hands. On the Razee Saga bridge, Buck Rivers watched in disbelief as the impossible became truth. The enemy's flagship, the unbreakable, the symbol of Federation might, was taken by boarding. The void fell strangely quiet even as battle still raged. Federation formations faltered. Command channels sputtered. The storm broke. And then, against every expectation, the transmission came. The Federation flagship's commander, wounded, beaten, but still alive, broadcast a single word across all frequencies. Ceasefire. The guns fell silent. Fighters broke away. Cruisers dimmed their weapons. Of the vast Federation armada, only the flagship, now in Alliance control, and a single surviving vessel remained. The rest burned in silence, wreckage tumbling through Halrow's skies. The battle was over. The galaxy itself seemed to pause, stunned that the Federation had halted its blow. In the aftermath, talks began aboard the wounded flagship, its hulls now crowded with Alliance banners. Federation envoys sat across from Buck Rivers, from Cryon generals, from Savarn counselors, from Tartan war leaders. Their voices were brittle, their pride cracked, but their message clear. The Federation would recognize Earth's promise. For now, rules were set, spoken like chains of fire. No Federation worlds would be touched. Their sovereignty would remain untouchable. But beyond their borders, every free lane, every neutral world, every forgotten system, the Alliance was free to act. Trade, defend, expand. The galaxy beyond Federation control was open. It was a truce born of necessity, not peace. Everyone in that chamber knew it. The Federation had bled, but not broken. They would remember. They would wait. They would strike again. As part of the agreement, the captured flagship was handed over as the Alliance's prize. Its hull, scarred but unbowed, was towed to Halros 9, where it was rebuilt not as a symbol of Federation dominance, but as the guardian of the trading station. Its guns now pointed outward, its shields tuned by Savarn, its hangars stocked with Earth's fighters. The flagship became a sentinel, proof that the Federation could bleed, proof that the Alliance could endure. When the banners rose again in the Bastion, they carried more than unity. They carried warning. The war was not over. It had only been paused. And somewhere beyond the stars, powers older still watched in silence, unease stirring in their shadows as Earth and its allies wrote a new chapter in fire. The promise was kept. The sword was wielded. The Bastion had held. And now the children were no more. The guns of Halros 9 had fallen silent, but the echoes of their fire carried farther than any ship could travel. Across the galaxy, worlds that had once bowed their heads to Federation tariffs and patrols now whispered of the battle where the children of Earth shattered the parents' hand. The Bastion's council chamber was no longer a hall of speculation. It had become the axis of a movement. The banners of Earth, Cryon, Savarn, and the Tartans hung heavy with meaning, their colors no longer mere symbols of defiance but of survival, of proof. The chamber rang with voices of emissaries who only weeks before would never have dared step through its doors. From the Rim came merchants, desperate but proud, offering their fleets in exchange for safe lanes. From the core ward systems came delegates who spoke carefully, their words heavy with the knowledge that the Federation still loomed over them, yet their eyes burned with the memory of the ceasefire and what it had meant. The Alliance was no longer theory. It was reality. The council grew. A dozen minor systems pledged in the weeks that followed, sending raw materials, food, engineers, and ships of every shape and age. None matched the firepower of the Razee II or the Shepherd, yet their presence carried weight. Every system that stood beneath the promise was another that the Federation could no longer isolate. But victory brought new burdens. Cryon worried that Earth's rise would cast them into shadow, even as they pledged their fleets. Savran whispered that the Federation's truce was a blade waiting to strike, that every day spent building was one less before the hammer fell again. The Tartans, emboldened by the defense of Tartus, demanded stronger fortifications across their borders, unwilling to be caught vulnerable again. Every voice had demands, and every demand carried urgency. Buck Rivers bore it in silence until the voices began to rise. Then he reminded them what had happened at Halros. They had not won because of one banner or one fleet or one commander. They had won because the Federation had thrown its full hand, and 4 worlds had caught it together. Halros did not belong to Earth. It belonged to the Alliance. If the Alliance was to endure, it must remain so. General Tudor spoke next, his voice like the weight of iron. He reminded the Council that victory had not come cheaply. 5,000 Marines had boarded the Federation flagship, but not all had returned. The Alliance's dead numbered in the tens of thousands, ships burned to embers, stations scarred. Their names must not be forgotten, nor must their sacrifice be squandered in division. The chamber fell silent, banners swaying in the artificial currents, until one by one the delegates bowed their assent. They would argue, yes. They would debate. But they would not fracture. The Alliance would hold. Outside the Bastion, the galaxy shifted. Refugee convoys arrived daily, carrying those who fled Federation worlds not because they were forced, but because they no longer believed the Federation could protect them. Merchants turned their routes toward Halros, eager to trade under the guns of the captured flagship now guarding the lanes. Engineers came from Savran to strengthen its shields. Tartans pledged crews to its batteries. Cryon seeded its docks with their precision mechanics. The fortress of Halros grew daily, its silhouette against the star a declaration that trade would never again be bound in chains. And in the halls of the Federation, silence reigned. They had called Earth children. They had called them reckless. But at Halros 9, the Federation had blinked. And in that blink, the galaxy had seen something it had not seen in centuries. Hope. Yet hope was dangerous. Hope spread. Hope demanded answers. And hope drew the gaze of those older powers who stirred beyond the rim, their attention sharpening on the Alliance like predators scenting prey. For now the Alliance grew. For now the galaxy bent toward them. But the weight of victory pressed as heavily as defeat. For every world that joined, another wondered how long the ceasefire would last. For every banner raised in unity, shadows deepened in places untouched. The Bastion thrummed with life, the great fortress a beacon of the promise. But in Buck River's eyes there lingered no triumph. Only the quiet knowledge that victory was never permanent. It was borrowed, and one day the Federation, or something worse, would come to reclaim it. For now Earth's promise held. The war quieted, but the silence was not idle. The Bastion's forges burned night and day, their spires spitting fire into the void as ship frames rose from skeletal beginnings into living hulls. Savran's iridium-powered new shield cores, Cryon alloys reinforced keels, Tartan shipwrights lent ancient designs that Earth's engineers reimagined with modern systems. What emerged from those yards was not the fleet of one world, but of many, each vessel bearing the touch of every banner in the Alliance. Training grounds spread across stations and planets alike. Earth's Marines drilled beside Cryon troopers and Savran exocets, their movements blending until they no longer resembled separate forces but a single tide of discipline. Tartans taught them ferocity, Cryon taught precision, Savran taught resilience, and Earth bound it together with doctrine that turned the lessons into unity. General Tudor walked the lines as often as he walked the Bastion's council halls, his voice carrying iron no matter the world, reminding every recruit that banners mattered less than the blood they would share when the time came. Amid the rhythm of training and shipbuilding, Admiral Buck Rivers took to the stars. The Razee II sailed at the head, her silhouette as much symbol as ship, her new hangars and weapon spines a reminder of what the Alliance had built. At her side drifted the Isabella II, cloaked in her rippling light but visible in deliberate measure, a phantom walking in daylight so that all could see what Earth had wrought. Their course wound through the new alliance, a voyage not of conquest but of introduction. Buck Rivers did not believe in faceless allies. If they were to fight and die together, he would know them and they him. At Cryon, he stood beneath the carved iron spires of their capital, greeted not with ceremony but with the solemn nods of warriors who judged by action, not words. They showed him their shipyards, their metallurgies, their sons and daughters who had once fought only for Cryon and now trained under Earth's banners. Buck listened, asked, learned, and left with their respect heavier than any salute. At Savran, he walked among the mines where Zeridium dust shimmered like starlight clinging to every hand. Scholars turned warriors bowed awkwardly, their cloaks marked with the soot of labor as much as battle. Buck thanked them not for their minerals but for their faith, and the Savran counselors wept openly, and used to leaders who saw them as more than resources. The Razee II left orbit to chants of promise that echoed across the cliffs. At Tartus, the Razee and Isabella entered orbit flanked by dreadnoughts that dwarfed mountains. The Tartans welcomed him with war drums and blades raised, their pride undimmed, yet now tempered with trust. They showed him the platforms Earth's foresight had given them, the stations that bristled with new guns and shields. Where once Tartans had doubted Earth's strength, now they sang songs of the promise around their hearth fires, and their leaders clasped Buck's arm with a respect given to equals, not guests. Everywhere the fleet went, the people gathered. They crowded spaceports, clinging to gantries, waving banners stitched in haste but flown with pride. Children shouted his name, not with fear but with hope, and for the first time Buck Rivers understood the full weight of what Earth had begun. This was no longer about battles or fleets or the grudges of empires. This was about a galaxy that had been told for centuries that resistance was futile, now seeing resistance in the flesh. Yet he did not forget the cost. In quiet moments aboard the Razee II, Buck walked the memorial decks where the names of the fallen from Halros had been etched into alloy walls. Cryon, Savran, Tartan, Earth, all together side by side. He traced the names in silence, remembering each as proof that the Alliance had not been born without blood. The Isabella II prowled close, her cloaks shimmering like a shadow that chose not to hide. Where the Razee was the hammer, Isabella was the phantom blade, her sudden arrivals and vanishings at each system a quiet reminder to every watching eye. The Alliance was not only strong, it was unpredictable. By the time the Razee II completed her circuit and returned to the Bastion, the Alliance was no longer a fragile pact sealed in desperation. It was becoming a people. Their shipyards thrummed, their soldiers drilled, their banners hung not only in chambers of state but in the homes of miners, traders, farmers, and refugees. The ceasefire with the Federation still held, but none aboard the Razee II mistook it for peace. It was only a pause, a breath before the storm returned. Buck Rivers knew it, and in his heart he carried the same vow spoken at Halros. They would be ready. The Bastion's comrades never slept. Signals from merchants, distress calls, coded messages, and Federation transmissions crackled endlessly across the void. But one night cycle, as the Alliance fleet drilled in Cryon orbit, a signal came that froze every officer at their stations. It was old, older than any databank should have still recognized. A frequency lost in archives, coded in a language cataloged only in fragments, one that had last been spoken before Earth had taken its first step beyond Sol. The signal pulsed in patterns not as a cry for help but as a summons. General Tudor and Buck Rivers stood side by side as Isabella II's cloaks rippled and her veins bent toward the source. The beacon had not been heard in living memory, yet now it called from the edge of the known galaxy, far beyond Federation borders. The system's charts marked it barren, forgotten, empty. Yet the pulse was steady, precise, deliberate. Someone wanted to be found. The Razee II and Isabella II led the expedition, flanked by Tartans, Cryon, and Savran escorts. Suspense sharpened every order. For days they crossed dark space, their fleets stretched into silence, until finally the signal drew them into orbit of a world that shimmered like glass in the void. It was no ruin, no graveyard. It was alive. Cities glowed across the surface, their towers sculpted like crystalline spires, their lights pulsing with a harmony that seemed more like heartbeat than technology. Orbital rings arced the planet, layered with station lattices that dwarfed even the Bastion. And from them came ships, sleek, silver-veined vessels that moved with a grace no Alliance fleet had ever seen. The comms opened, not in Federation trade tongue, not in Cryon dialects, not in Savran cadence. The voice that spoke was older, steadier, layered with tones that seemed to echo from deeper places than throats. Welcomed them by name: Earth, Cryon, Savran, Tartan. It named them all, and spoke of knowing their histories. The scholars of Yrianss had returned. The Yrianss were thought to have vanished millennia ago. History books spoke of them only in whispers, the lost archivists of the Rim, an ancient society that had once catalogued every species they met and then simply disappeared. The Federation never spoke of them. Cryon and Savran dismissed them as myth. Tartans called them dreamers who had fled the galaxy. Yet here they stood, not myth, not ruin, but thriving. Their emissaries came aboard the Razee 2, robes of woven light cascading from tall, slender frames. Their eyes shimmered with depthless silver, and in their hands they carried tablets older than empires, filled with records stretching back to the dawn of spacefaring history. They spoke not of needing aid. They had not called in desperation. They had called because the Alliance existed, and they wished to stand beside it. Their terms were simple: a seat at the council table, recognition as equals, and the promise that their archives would never again be silenced. In exchange, they offered technology that turned the chamber silent. Shields layered in cascading folds that could shrug off firepower even Titans had unleashed. Weapons that bled energy in rippling pulses, designed not only to destroy but to disorient entire formations. Shipbuilding methods that halved construction times and doubled efficiency. And more. In their archives, bound in starlight pages and crystalline cores, were fragments of history of those who came before. Races older than the Yrianss, older than any now living who had once ruled the void. Their names were lost, their motives forgotten, but the Yrianss claimed they were not gone. Only watching, waiting, and with Earth's rise they had begun to stir again. Suspense filled the chamber aboard the Bastion when the Yrianss made their vow. They had hidden long enough, fearing the Federation's hunger for their knowledge. But Earth's promise had awakened the galaxy. The children had become more. The Yrianss would no longer remain silent. Admiral Buck Rivers bowed his head, not as commander but as peer, and extended the invitation. The Yrianss joined the Alliance. For the first time since its founding, the council table grew not with warriors or traitors, but with keepers of memory, a race who remembered everything and who now brought the weight of forgotten knowledge to the side of the promise. Yet even in the moment of triumph, the warning lingered. If those who came before truly stirred in the void, then even the Federation would one day be a lesser shadow. And when that day came, Earth would need more than fleets. It would need wisdom. The Yrianss had returned, and the galaxy would never be the same. The Yrianss wasted no time in proving that myth had teeth. Within weeks of joining the Alliance, their ships fanned out across Council worlds. On Cryon they taught new welding harmonics that fused alloys with strength beyond metallurgy's once thought impossible. On Savran they rewrote reactor flows, turning Zeridium shields into living veils that flexed and absorbed with grace instead of brute force. On Tartus they walked through the dreadnought yards and, with a few words and sketches, doubled the efficiency of centuries-old shipwright traditions. On Earth, their scholars moved quietly through Bastion Dock, eyes bright with calculations, their thoughts already pulling the station into futures others could not yet see. The knowledge was not given like gifts. It was planted like seeds, carefully, deliberately, with the understanding that the Alliance must grow into it rather than consume it all at once. The Shepherd was the first to test their promise. Its cannons lit the void in a full broadside, a resonance cascade meant to crack even Federation Titans. But the Illyrian shields shimmered, folding into themselves, bending without breaking, until the fury of Earth's might faded against them. When the glow dimmed, the shields still stood unscarred. The test left silence across every council chamber. Even the Tartans, who measured truth only in fire and steel, bowed their heads in acknowledgement. At Bastion Dock, Illyrian engineers traced their fingers along alloy ribs and spoke in voices quiet as prayers. They saw flaws others had missed, potential others could not imagine. They promised upgrades but gave no detail. Only Buck Rivers saw the way their eyes lingered on the station's heart, and though they explained little, he understood enough. The Bastion would become something greater. When and how remained unspoken. Plans spread further. New Bastion docks at Tartus, where Tartan warship forges would rise higher than mountains, and at Savran, where Zeridium veins would flow directly into construction bays. Each dock would serve not one world but all. Together they would birth fleets stronger, faster, and deadlier than any the Federation could muster. Fleets not of conquest but of survival. The council chamber filled with talk of numbers, of hull counts, of weapons, of supply chains stretching across star systems now bound to the promise. But the Illyrians spoke differently. They spoke of memory, of archives that stretched back before the Federation had even risen, of civilizations that had once thought themselves eternal and yet fell. They reminded the Alliance that strength was not merely guns and ships, but the will to hold together when the void pressed hardest. In those words, Buck Rivers saw the path ahead. The ceasefire with the Federation would not last. Those who came before stirred in shadow. The galaxy would test them again. But this time, the Alliance would not meet the storm with desperation. They would meet it with preparation. With shipyards that sang day and night. With shields that bent but did not break. With weapons that struck harder than the Federation could imagine. With unity stronger than fear. As the Illyrians' banners joined the circle in the bastion, the chamber glowed with colors never seen together before. Earth, Priam, Savran, Tartans. And now, the silver of the Illyrians, a hue that shimmered like memory itself. The war was not over. The shadow of the Federation lingered. The whispers of those who came before grew louder in the Illyrians' eyes. But for the first time, the Alliance did not stand only in defiance. It stood in readiness. And in the quiet after the council adjourned, Buck Rivers stood aboard the Razee Saga dome and looked out at the stars, Isabella II prowling like a shadow at his flank. For once, he allowed himself the rarest of luxuries. Hope. The promise was kept. The sword was drawn. The bastion was built. The children were no more. Now the Alliance was becoming something greater. And tomorrow waited. Like and subscribe for more tales of Buck Rivers and the Razee Saga.